Somewhere in the southern hemisphere, far from every contested strait, in every fractured alliance, sits a continent-sized democracy. It has more arable land than any country on earth, 12% of the world's fresh water, the cleanest industrial grid of any major economy, a near monopoly on the minerals the world cannot function without, and millions of barrels per day of oil that transit no choke point a hostile power can close. That country is Brazil. And on average, the institutions represented in this room own less than 1% of it. So before I make that case, you should know who is making it. My name is Drew Crawford. I'm an American. I live in Florianópolis, Brazil, and I've spent the better part of 12 years in Brazil. Falo português fluentemente, and I've been to 13 states, 30 cities across all 5 regions of Brazil. I've visited mining operations in Minas Gerais in the Northeast. I've sat with the state government in Manaus, and I've met with industrial families of the South. I'm not analyzing this country from a desk in New York. The thesis I'm about to share with you is built from the ground. So for the next 10 minutes, I want to make you uncomfortable about what you own and what you do not. The world your portfolios are built in does not exist anymore. The assumption that critical minerals would always flow to whoever would pay the market price is dead. Shipping lanes get disrupted and stay disrupted. Mineral export bans multiply. Defense budgets surge. Food prices never come back down. The question every serious allocator should be asking today is no longer when will things stabilize. They will not. The real question is, where are the resources the world cannot do without, and who controls them? Brazil is the only large democracy on earth that does 5 things at once. First, it feeds the world. Second, it has the fresh water to keep doing so through every climate scenario the UN has put on paper. Third, its industrial economy runs on the cleanest grid of any major country by a factor of 4. Fourth, no major supply chain and critical minerals can be built without Brazilian reserves. And finally, one forest on Brazilian sovereign territory stores more carbon than every regulated market in Europe has ever priced. All of it exported through ports that face the open Atlantic with no contested strait in between. There is no other major economy on earth with this profile, not one. And for the rest of my time, I'm going to prove it. I'm going to break the 3 beliefs that are keeping your capital from moving south. So the first reason Brazil is mispriced is that every allocator in this room has been trained to model it as a policy trade. Every time you've looked at Brazil, some analyst puts an election cycle in front of you, or a Selic decision, or a Lula headline, or a Bolsonaro headline. You think you are evaluating a country. In reality, all you're seeing is noise. The thesis is physics. Let's start with soil. Brazil has more unused arable land than any country on earth. That one sentence should wake up every allocator in this room. It means Brazil can approximately double its cultivated area without touching a single hectare of the Amazon using technology that already exists. And here is how I know that's not theoretical. The Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture has launched a national program to convert 40 million hectares of degraded pasture in crop production over the next decade. The committed capital is $120 billion in public and private investment, and that is half of all degraded land in the country. The doubling I just described is not my projection, is already underway. No other agricultural superpower has this headroom. The United States is fully utilized. China is losing farmland to urbanization at a rate that terrifies its own central planners. India is hitting diminishing returns against water stress. And Europe is hemmed in by geography and regulation. Brazil is already the world's largest net food exporter, leading the planet in soybeans, coffee, sugar, orange juice, beef, and poultry. Agribusiness is 25% of GDP and close to half of all exports. A single farm in Mato Grosso, owned by the Bom Futuro Group, cultivates 650,000 hectares, roughly the size of Delaware. That's just one family. Now let's talk about water. Brazil holds 12% of the world's fresh water. The Amazon alone carries 20% of all river water that flows on the surface of this planet. And unlike in California, in India, or in northern China, Brazilian agriculture is largely rain-fed. When those irrigation systems fail, and they will fail, Brazil's water advantage does not just hold, it compounds. Then there's energy. 87% of Brazil's electricity comes from renewable sources. The carbon intensity of the Brazilian grid is 60 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour. The United States emits more than 6 times that. China emits more than 9 times that. Under any carbon border adjustment mechanism that the UE or the US enacts, every mill, every smelter, every factory in Brazil gains a structural cost advantage that no policy in Brasilia has to defend. And then there's oil. The pre-salt fields hold 30 to 40 billion barrels of premium low sulfur crude. Petrobras is producing 4 million barrels per day and climbing. That oil transits the Atlantic, and it passes through no strait Iran controls, no canal Houthi drones can reach, no choke point Chinese naval expansion can threaten. The risks you will hear about Brazil this week are stories about institutions. The endowment I just described is physics. Institutions change, physics does not. Over a 50-year horizon, you already know which one wins. The second reason Brazil's mispriced is that everyone in this room already knows China controls the critical mineral supply chain, and almost everyone has stopped at that sentence. China controls refining. Brazil holds the reserves. That is a sentence your portfolio is not built around. Start with niobium. Niobium is the alloying element that makes your high-performance steel strong enough for jet engines, pipelines, rockets, and aircraft carriers. The next generation of EV batteries, the ones Toshiba and Volkswagen are already running in road tests, use niobium anodes that charge in 10 minutes, last up to 3 times longer, and are safer than conventional lithium ion. Brazil controls roughly 90% of the world's niobium supply. A single company, CBMM, owned by the Moreira Salles family, the same family that controls Itaú Unibanco, the largest Latin American bank, produces over 80% of the global supply from a single mine in Araxá, Minas Gerais. The European Union sources 86% of its niobium from Brazil. The United States has not had meaningful production since 1959. Call it what it is, a near monopoly on a mineral the world cannot function without. And niobium is just the headline. Brazil holds the second largest global reserves of nickel and graphite, the second largest rare earth reserves on the planet only behind China, is the largest lithium producer outside the lithium triangle in Australia with output doubling year over year, and ranks in the global top 10 for copper. There's one number that you should keep you awake at night. Less than half of Brazilian territory has ever been geologically surveyed. Let me say that again. Less than half of Brazilian territory has ever been geologically surveyed. The country that is already top 5 globally for nearly every critical mineral has not yet mapped half its land. The upside is not priced because the upside has not been measured. If OPEC's control of oil defined 20th century geopolitics, Brazil's control of critical minerals defines the 21st. And unlike Gulf oil, Brazil's minerals sit in a stable democracy with deep water ports facing the open Atlantic. The third reason Brazil's mispriced is the most important one for the allocators in this room. It is also the reason the Brazilian companies represented here today have a harder time accessing U.S. capital than they should. Most of you with Brazil exposure own the Bovespa through an EM index, 1 or 2% of your 1 or 2% of your portfolio, and you think that is your Brazil bet. It is not. The Bovespa is dominated by a handful of well-covered mega caps, efficiently priced, heavily correlated with Brazilian macro. Owning the index is owning the same noise the thesis I just walked you through specifically rejects. The real opportunity lives where the index cannot see. It lives in the mid-market industrial operators in the southern states represented at this event today, Paraná, Rio Grande do Sul, and Santa Catarina. Family-owned businesses doing $200 to $500 million in revenue, 25 to 30% EBITDA, zero international capital on the cap table, and no appetite to IPO on the B3. I sat across from the tables from these families, and they deliver the kind of capital efficiency American operators stopped showing 20 years ago. And many of them have never met an American investor in their lives. Move north, and the thesis lives in the agricultural corridors of Mato Piba, where farmland trades at a fraction of Iowa multiples on land that produces harvests 2 times a year. Go inland, and it lives in the lithium valley of Minas Gerais, in the rare earth plays in Goiás, in the infrastructure concessions the Brazilian government is auctioning at yields the U.S. has not seen since the 1980s. These businesses are too small for Goldman and Morgan Stanley, too complex for your passive allocation, and run by operators who have compounded quietly through hyperinflation, Colar, through Lava Jato, and through 4 currency regimes. They do not need a bull market. They need capital, governance, and access to international markets. Finding them requires being on the ground, speaking their language, and being trusted by families that have never opened their cap table to outsiders. Ask yourself one question honestly. What is your current allocation to Brazil? For most of you in this room, the answer is between 0 and negligible. The S&P trades at elevated multiples, concentrated in 7 tech companies, in a country whose farmland is fully utilized, whose freshwater is declining, and whose military is deployed to keep oil flowing through straits on the other side of the planet. Meanwhile, the economy I just described to you is available at a fraction of the valuation with export routes that face the open Atlantic. There are 2 kinds of investors. Those who bought American farmland in 1870 because they understood the endowment, and those who bought it in 1920 after the railroads had already proven the thesis. Both made money. One made generational wealth. Brazil is the 1870 ticket. You're holding it now. The only question is whether you read it before the train leaves the station. I'm an American, and I chose to build my business and my life in Brazil because of what I just described to you and where the world is moving over the next 50 years. Austral Continental exists because someone has to sit between these 2 worlds and make each one legible to each other. Thank you. Muito obrigado.